It's Tuesday, December 4th. It was well past midnight when people living in houses outside the Union Carbide pesticide plant first started to get the smell. Many accounts describe the smell as similar to that of burning chilies. At first, then it got worse. Mothers watched as their babies choked to death. People ran out onto the streets, vomiting in a daze. Bodies frothing at the mouth piled up on the roads. Within weeks, 8,000 people died. The death count went up to 15,000 in the months ahead. Around 5 lakh people stood exposed to the deadly methylisocyanate. These lakhs and a generation to come would bear the burden of crippling medical bills. It was the world's worst ever industrial disaster. The tragedy would also come to be known as the Bhopal betrayal. Here's why. In the years leading up to the tragedy, there were at least 2, although smaller, leaks at the plant. The CBI, which investigated the case, said none of the plant's safety systems were operational. The methylisocyanate tank's refrigeration system was switched off as a cost-cutting measure. The CBI said criminally negligent operational practices resulted in the leakage of methyl isocyanate, and these were in the knowledge of the management and were deliberately ignored for commercial reasons. The tragedy would soon turn into a farce. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide, reaches Bhopal and is arrested at the airport. He is taken to a posh guest house of the Union Carbide company and is placed under house arrest. Anderson, who evidently worked the phones at the guest house to get the US administration to pressure New Delhi, secures bail the same day. He is escorted to the airport, reportedly by the superintendent of police. An official recalls a Super King Airby 200 was already kept waiting for him. Arjun Singh, then Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, would, decades later, look to pass the buck onto then Union Home Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. Warren Anderson never returned to face trial and lived the good life in the Hamptons till his death in 2014. In February 1985, the Indian government filed claims for $3.3 billion from Union Carbide in a US court. The next year, the US court transferred all Bhopal litigation to India. In December 1987, the CBI filed its charge sheet against Anderson and other accused under sections of culpable homicide. 2 years later, the Indian government and Union Carbide struck an out-of-court settlement for $470 million that came to a paltry $500 per victim. When asked about that pitiful sum, Kathy Hunt, spokesperson for Dow Chemicals that bought Union Carbide, said $500 is plenty good for an Indian. Yes, you heard that right. Dow Chemicals earns billions of dollars in profits every year. Dow, incidentally, always maintained it did not inherit Union Carbide's liabilities. But
if you look at very, very similar damage in the sense of there was asbestos poisoning in the United States caused by a subsidiary of Union Carbide, the Union Carbide Corporation, the New York entity, and prior to the takeover of the New York entity by Dow Chemicals, right? So in terms of corporate structures, it was identical to the violations in Bhopal, right? However, those claims were disclosed to the Securities and Exchange Commission as a charge on Dow Chemicals as, as a sort of liability that they claim, right? So here you have a third world victim and you have a first world victim, and the first world victim's life is blatantly more valuable here, in a way that it's such a deep shame.
Not helping matters was what was evidently the corporate-governmental nexus at work.
The government also failed to deal with the commercial aspects, the commercial law aspects of the veil piercing between the various corporate entities in order to find liability for Dow Chemicals and Union Carbide. And then, we saw that in court, there were times that the counsel for Dow Chemicals and Union Carbide, they get the most fancy fat cat counsels, right? were then saying that, oh, my friend the AG and I should sort it out, and trying to shut out the victims. So there are many layers of this corporate governmental nexus, and it's very, very hard to break.
The initial settlement between the Indian government and Union Carbide included quashing criminal charges against the officials responsible for the leak. The charges were later reinstated. In September 1996, the court reduced the charges against the accused from Section 304 Part 2, which is culpable homicide, to Section 304A, which is causing death by rash or negligent act. Or, in the words of one of the lawyers for the Bhopal gas victims,
it's in the nature of a traffic accident. We had a traffic accident in Bhopal. As far as the law is concerned, as far as the people are concerned, you have second and third generations of victims who are unable to walk, have terrible health, have genetic mutations.
26 years after the case was filed, 8 people were held guilty of that negligence and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Anderson, of course, was never extradited. Just a week after that judgment, American hypocrisy was on display, with then President Barack Obama reacting to the Gulf oil spill, talked tough, saying,
BP is responsible for this leak. BP will be paying the bill.
A total of 11 people died in that disaster. In the wake of the Bhopal verdict, then Union Law Minister Veerappa Moily said there was an urgent need to codify the law of torts to ensure that corporations don't get away with mass murder. The lack of codified tort law, most experts agree, has severely been felt. Tort law is based on the premise that an individual who causes harm must compensate for that harm. Now, experts argue that one of the reasons Union Carbide set up operations in India is because there wasn't any system to ensure corporate accountability. Class action suits, a powerful tool to ensure corporate ethics, is non-existent in India. Corporates understand the language of money, so whatever they do has to be financially viable for them. So for a Union Carbide to have ensured that safety mechanisms are in place and working, they would have to know that the price for not doing so would far outweigh the costs. As for the question, are we better prepared today for a Bhopal-like disaster?
So the answer is absolutely no, we are not equipped. You take a situation where you had a nuclear disaster, and it is conceivable that the fallout of the nuclear disaster would look like, and the penalty for such a fallout would be like a traffic accident.
This video, purportedly showing Deputy Superintendent of Police in Mazalgaon Taluka, Bhagyashree Navtake, saying she filed false cases against Dalits and Muslims, was aired on multiple news channels. The Superintendent of Bid has now ordered an inquiry after local Dalit organizations filed a complaint. The police say they are searching for the original video to ascertain if it was doctored. In the video, a person who appears to be Bhagyashree Navtake is heard speaking to a group of Marathas who reportedly reached out to her for help after being booked under the Scheduled Caste Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act. She is heard saying, "I tie the hands and legs of Dalits and take out my anger about the Atrocities Act on them." She also says she has filed false cases against 21 Dalits who had tried to file complaints under the SC/ST Act at police stations in her jurisdiction. At the beginning of the video, the person also says she has filed false cases under Section 307 of the Indian Penal Code, which is attempt to murder against Muslims so that they do not get bail easily. 195 countries have assembled for a 2-week summit in Poland's coal heartland, Katowice, to talk climate change. This COP24 summit, or the 24th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, will finalize details on how countries will go about cutting emissions, monitoring and reporting them to reach the goals set in COP21, or the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, or better, the dream goal of pre-industrial 1.5 degrees Celsius. The World Bank announced a $200 billion budget to tackle climate change, twice its current 5-year investment, in climate change. With the UN's emissions gap report having stated that the total annual global greenhouse gas emission in 2017 was 0.7 billion tons higher than that for 2016, the first such increase in 4 years, and the 2018 end deadline for negotiations on the rule book drawing to a close, climate negotiators in Katowice are sure feeling the heat. The 2 weeks will be fraught with politics as well, as countries including Poland and Australia remain hesitant to cut back on coal. Brazil, who drew out from hosting next year's climate summit, has threatened to pull out of the pact altogether. The US, remember, pulled out of the Paris Agreement in June 2017. The Paris deal was also the first that called for unified action, which means developing countries will not receive watered-down emission reduction goals like earlier. India's focus will be to ensure that the policy of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is applied in all elements of the Paris Agreement. This is a principle of international environmental law that establishes that all states are responsible for addressing global environmental destruction, yet not equally responsible because of the wide differences in levels of economic development. India met like-minded developing countries in November to develop a unified position on key issues and decided to corner rich states on their inadequate pre-2020 climate actions. Vehicles and buildings were set alight in central Paris as yellow jacket or yellow vest protesters, named after the neon vests French motorists are meant to carry in their vehicles, took to the streets and clashed with the police. The rioting that began as an agitation against fuel taxes has turned into an anti-government movement. It has been described as the worst unrest in Paris in decades. Graffiti on the base of the Arc de Triomphe, one of France's most famous monuments, a national symbol, read, "We have chopped off heads for less than this," and toppled the bourgeois. Reuters reports authorities were caught off guard by the escalation in violence after 2 weeks of nationwide unrest against fuel taxes and high living costs. The news agency quoted authorities as saying violent groups from the far right and far left, as well as thugs from the suburbs, had infiltrated the Yellow Vest movement in Paris. The New York Times reports the unrest over mounting inequalities has been building in intensity over the past 3 weeks. And with little organization, relying mostly on social media, they have moved spontaneously from France's poor regions to Paris, where they have become impossible to ignore. And finally, if inspired by all these celebrity weddings, you are looking for the perfect proposal spot, we suggest keep it away from drains. A New York man managed the perfect proposal at Times Square and scored a "Yes, I will," but managed to accidentally drop his ring into a grate out of excitement. Horrified, the two struggled to retrieve the ring and then called the police. A good-humoured NYPD sent out their best man, who saved the day and the engagement. You stay engaged to the news. And if you like it, put a subscribe on it. See you. Love your morning fix? Help support our journalism. Subscribe to Scroll Plus using the link in the description.